The preacher had barely finished saying the words when Isaac Dalton turned to look at his bride and felt the ground shift beneath his boots. Not because Sarah Townsend was plain. She was not plain. She was the furthest thing from plain that the territory of Colorado had ever produced, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a simple ivory bonnet, and eyes the precise color of sage after rain, gray-green and alive with something that looked dangerously close to contempt. She was 22 years old, straight-backed as a rifle, and she was staring at him with an expression that could have cured leather. "You lost a bet," she said, low enough that only he could hear it, her voice barely above a whisper in the little clapboard church of Redemption Creek, Colorado, 1882. "And I am the consequence." The 40-odd souls gathered in the pews behind them shifted uncomfortably. They had all come to watch the spectacle. The whole town knew what had happened 3 days ago at the Silver Spur Saloon, when Isaac Dalton, rancher, sometime gambler, and man who had never in his 30 years of living lost at poker, had lost spectacularly at poker. Isaac kept his eyes on Sarah and felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with embarrassment. He had expected to marry a woman who would be grateful for the arrangement, perhaps a little worn around the edges, someone who needed the Dalton name and the Dalton land and would ask no questions. He had not expected this. He had not expected her. "The consequence," he repeated carefully, like a man testing ice over a river he was not certain would hold him. "You heard me." She turned back to face the preacher, who was sweating through his collar. "You may proceed, Reverend." Isaac Dalton had ridden into more dangerous situations than a church full of witnesses, and a woman who looked at him like he was a problem she intended to solve. He had tracked outlaws through the San Juan Mountains in January. He had once talked his way out of a standoff with 3 armed men who wanted his cattle and his life. He was not afraid. He told himself this very firmly as he placed the ring on Sarah Townsend's finger and felt her hand, which was warm and steady and entirely calm, and realized with absolute clarity that he was lying to himself. He was terrified. 3 days earlier, the Silver Spur Saloon had been loud, hot and smelling of tobacco smoke and spilled rye whiskey. Isaac had been winning all night, which was his habit, and the men around the table had been growing increasingly desperate, which was also his habit to produce in others. Redemption Creek was a town of about 400 souls in 1882, perched at the eastern edge of the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad had come through 2 years prior, which meant the town was growing faster than its manners, and new money was arriving alongside new trouble every week. Isaac Dalton's ranch, the Double D, 600 acres of good grazing land that his father had broken out of raw wilderness, and that Isaac had doubled in size through a combination of intelligence and stubbornness, sat 7 miles northeast of town, which was close enough to be convenient and far enough to feel sovereign. He had not intended to be gambling that particular Tuesday evening. He had come to town to collect a harness from the blacksmith and ended up at the Silver Spur because Tom Hagen had called out to him from the door and told him they needed a 6th man for the table, and Isaac had never in his life been able to refuse a game of poker. The man across from him was Fletcher Webb, who owned the grain and feed operation on the south end of Main Street, and who had more money than sense and enough stubborn pride to keep doubling down when any rational man would have walked away. Fletcher had been losing for 2 hours when he pushed everything he had left into the center of the table, his cash, the deed to a piece of land he owned adjacent to the Dalton ranch, and something else. "I will put in the Townsend girl," Fletcher said, and the table went very quiet. Isaac looked up. "The what?" "The Townsend girl, Sarah Townsend." Fletcher's face was red and shining. "Her father owes me a considerable debt, a debt he cannot pay. I have a legal arrangement, signed and witnessed, that gives me the right to arrange her marriage as settlement of that debt. I will put that arrangement into the pot." The silence around the table was the kind that comes before a thunderclap. Isaac set his cards face down on the felt. "That is not a thing a man should put into a card game, Fletcher." "It is a legal instrument," Fletcher said stiffly. "It is a woman," Isaac said. "It is a business arrangement," Fletcher insisted. One her father agreed to freely. Isaac looked at the men around the table. Tom Hagen was studying his boots. Old Pete Calloway from the livery was looking at the ceiling. Nobody was meeting anyone's eyes. He should have walked away. Later, he would understand this with perfect clarity. He should have stood up, pocketed his winnings, and ridden home in the cool autumn night and slept with a clean conscience. He should have done a great many things that he did not do. What he did instead was call the bet. Because he was thinking, and this was the thought that would haunt him for weeks afterward, that if Fletcher Webb won, which Fletcher Webb did not deserve to do, then Sarah Townsend, whoever she was, would end up married to a man who had just wagered her like a piece of property. And if Isaac won, he could find the girl, explain the situation, tear up whatever legal document Fletcher had signed, and send her father the money to clear the debt through legitimate means. That was what he told himself. He turned over his cards, 3 aces and 2 kings, a full house, powerful enough to win 9 games out of 10. Fletcher turned over 4 sevens. The whole table stared at the cards for a long moment. "Well," Fletcher said, with a smile that Isaac immediately wanted to remove from his face, "looks like you are getting married, Dalton." Isaac Dalton had ridden the 7 miles home in the cool Colorado autumn night, with Fletcher Webb's legal document in his coat pocket, and a feeling in his stomach like he had swallowed something that disagreed with him profoundly. He arrived at his ranch house, a solid 2-story stone and timber structure that his father had built in 1861, and that Isaac had expanded with a proper kitchen and a covered porch, and sat at his kitchen table until the small hours of the morning, reading the document over and over. It was, as Fletcher had said, legal. Beautifully, infuriatingly legal. Howard Townsend had signed away the right to arrange his unmarried daughter's marriage as security on a loan of $800 taken 2 years ago, and he had defaulted on that loan 6 months past. Fletcher Webb had the legal right, in the language of the document, to present Sarah Townsend to any man of Fletcher's choosing and compel the arrangement. The compulsion part was where things became complicated in Isaac's mind. He did not know if he believed a document like this could actually force anyone to do anything in the practical sense. But he knew that if Fletcher Webb wanted to use it against a family that was already in debt and desperate, he could make their lives extraordinarily difficult. He rode to the Townsend property the following morning. It was a small homestead about 4 miles south of town, 160 acres of not very productive scrubland that Howard Townsend had filed on under the Homestead Act 6 years ago, when he had come west from Missouri with his daughter, and the optimism of a man who had never farmed land that did not want to be farmed. The house was a modest adobe structure. The barn leaned slightly to the east. There was a kitchen garden that showed signs of careful tending, which was more than could be said for the fields. Howard Townsend came out onto the porch when he heard Isaac's horse and stood there squinting into the morning sun. He was a man of about 50, gray and thin, with the look of someone who had worked hard all his life and not had much to show for it. His expression when he recognized Isaac Dalton was complicated, a mixture of apprehension and something that might have been relief. "Mr. Dalton," he said, "Mr. Townsend." Isaac dismounted, tied his horse at the post. "I have something to discuss with you. I imagine you do." They were still standing there on the porch, Howard Townsend's face going steadily more pale as Isaac explained the situation, when the front door opened and Sarah Townsend came out. She was carrying a basket of wet laundry and had been clearly on her way to the clothesline when she heard the conversation. She stopped. She set the basket down very deliberately on the porch railing. She looked at her father first, and what was in her eyes in that moment was something Isaac could not entirely read. It was not surprise exactly. It was something more like a terrible confirmation. Then she looked at Isaac, and her expression shifted into something altogether different. Cool. Assessing. like she was taking the measure of a man she was trying to decide whether to trust. "You won the document," she said. "It was not a question." "I did," Isaac said. "Then I suppose you have come to inform me of my fate." The word fate came out with a careful flatness that was somehow more pointed than anger would have been. Isaac cleared his throat. "I have come to inform you that I intend to tear up the document and send your father the $800 to clear the debt directly, so that this arrangement has no legal basis." A pause. Sarah Townsend looked at him steadily. "Why?" "Because a woman is not a gambling stake," Isaac said. Something shifted in her expression just slightly, just for a moment, like a door opening a fraction and then being firmly closed again. "And what do you want in return for this generosity?" "Nothing," he said, and he meant it. Howard Townsend put his head in his hands. "Sarah," he said, in a voice like a man reading his own sentence, "there is a complication." And that was when Isaac learned about the second document. Fletcher Webb, it turned out, was not a man who had constructed only one layer of legal trap. He had gone to the county seat at Durango 3 days before the poker game, and had that first document formalized by a territorial judge, an old friend of his. And he had done it in a way that meant that even if Isaac tore up his copy, the original was on record. And the original, as filed, named Fletcher Webb as the party with authority over the arrangement, not the holder of any copy, which meant that destroying Isaac's copy did nothing to Fletcher's actual legal standing. Furthermore, and this was the part that made Isaac's jaw tighten, Howard Townsend had signed a secondary document at the same time that had not been disclosed at the poker table, one that transferred a lien on the Townsend homestead to Fletcher Webb, which would come due in 30 days if the debt remained unsettled. "He has been planning this for months," Sarah said, her voice very quiet and very controlled, in the way that a fire is controlled when there is not yet enough air to become what it wants to be. "He wants our land. Our land sits between his grain operation and the railroad spur. He has wanted it for 2 years. Isaac looked at her. She was not crying. He got the impression that she did not cry often, not because she lacked feeling, but because she had trained herself out of it the way you train yourself out of flinching. "How long have you known?" That he was maneuvering towards something. "Since spring." She met his gaze directly. "I did not know exactly what form it would take." Isaac stood very still for a moment, turning the shape of the problem over in his mind the way he might turn a trapped animal's situation over, looking for the exit. There were several options. He could go to Durango himself and contest the document at the territorial level, but that would take months and money he was not certain Howard Townsend had. He could try to pay the $800 directly to clear the debt, but if the document was already a matter of record with a territorial judge, simply paying the debt might not extinguish the arrangement. "There is one way," Sarah said, and her voice was so steady that he looked at her sharply. "What way?" "If I am already married," she said, "and married not by Fletcher Webb's arrangement but by my own choice, the arrangement becomes unenforceable. A married woman cannot be compelled into a second marriage. The document's authority depends on my unmarried status." Silence stretched between them on the porch. A jay called somewhere in the scrub oak. The wet laundry dripped slowly in the basket on the railing. "You are proposing that we marry," Isaac said. "I am proposing that if we chose to marry, the trap Fletcher Webb has constructed falls apart," she said carefully. "I am not proposing anything about your feelings or mine. I am describing a legal reality." Isaac studied her face. She was looking back at him with that steady gray-green gaze, and he understood with a clarity that surprised him that this was a woman who had already made her decision. She had probably made it before he had finished explaining the situation. She had looked at the shape of the trap and found the one exit, and she was standing in that exit now, waiting to see if he had the sense to walk through it beside her. "I would not want you to feel forced," he said. "Mr. Dalton," Sarah said, with the ghost of something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, "I have been managing on my own for a considerable time. The question is not whether I feel forced. The question is whether you are a man worth trusting with a serious decision." He was quiet for a moment, And if you decide I am not, then I will find another way, she said simply. He believed her completely. Your father will need to agree, Isaac said. Howard Townsend lifted his head from his hands and looked at his daughter with an expression of such complicated guilt and love and sorrow that it made something ache in Isaac's chest. Sarah, I am so sorry. I am so sorry for all of this. Papa, she said, and her voice was gentle now, genuinely gentle in a way it had not been for Isaac. It is all right. Things will be all right. She looked back at Isaac. Will they be all right, Mr. Dalton? Yes, he said. They will. They were married 2 days later, on a Thursday morning in October 1882, in the little white clapboard church of Redemption Creek, Colorado. The congregation was substantial, because news in a small western town moved at approximately the speed of a telegraph wire crossed with a wildfire, and everyone for 10 miles had heard about the poker game and the document and the rapid-fire wedding arrangement. They came partly out of curiosity and partly out of something more complicated, the uncomfortable awareness that they had all been present, or nearby, or at least aware, when Fletcher Webb had put a woman on a gambling table, and none of them had done anything about it. Fletcher Webb himself was not in attendance. He had been informed of the marriage plans by a very brief letter from Isaac Dalton's lawyer in Durango, because Isaac had ridden to Durango the day before the wedding to get his lawyer involved, and had reportedly turned the letter several colors of red in his office, and then gone very quiet in the way that dangerous men go quiet. The preacher, Reverend Aldous Marsh, was a nervous man on the best of days, and this was not the best of days. He rushed through the service with the energy of someone who was aware that any number of things could still go wrong. Isaac and Sarah stood side by side at the front of the church, and if their bearing was not precisely that of two people deeply in love, it was at least the bearing of two people who had made a serious decision and intended to honor it. When Reverend Marsh said, "You may kiss the bride," there was a pause that lasted long enough to be noticeable to everyone in the pews. Isaac turned to look at Sarah. She was looking straight ahead, her chin level, her jaw set. He could see the pulse beating at the base of her throat. He leaned forward and touched his lips to her cheek, which was warm and smelled of lavender soap, and felt her go very slightly still, like a breath held and not yet released. The congregation applauded, because that was what you did, and the sound echoed off the pine walls of the little church and out into the October morning. Afterward, standing on the church steps in the thin Colorado autumn sunlight, Sarah stood at Isaac's side and received the handshakes and cautious congratulations of Redemption Creek citizens with perfect composure. A number of women came to embrace her with the careful warmth of people who were sorry they had not done more sooner, and were expressing that sorrow sideways through physical affection. Sarah accepted this with grace and thanked everyone and smiled the exact right amount. Isaac watched her do this and thought, she has been taking care of people for a long time. His housekeeper, a capable and warm-hearted woman named Mee Rodriguez who had managed the Dalton Ranch house for 6 years, had known about the wedding since the previous day and had prepared a wedding dinner for when they returned. And she received Sarah at the front door of the Stone Ranch house with a firm handshake, and an assessment that lasted about 4 seconds and ended in what appeared to be a favorable verdict. "You will want a proper tour," Mee said. "Come along." Isaac watched his bride follow his housekeeper through the front door of his house and thought, she is not afraid of anything. He was not certain if that reassured him or terrified him further. He had given Sarah the large bedroom at the top of the stairs, which had been his parents' room, and had stood empty since his father's death 4 years prior. He had moved his own things into the smaller room at the back of the house, which had been his room when he was a boy, and still felt faintly of that smaller self. He had told himself this arrangement was simply practical and appropriate, and that both of them would require time and trust before anything else could be considered, and he had instructed himself firmly not to think about the warmth of her cheek beneath his lips or the steady gray-green of her eyes. He was, on the whole, not succeeding at the not thinking part, Sarah came down to supper that first evening in a dark blue dress that was clearly her best one, freshly pressed, and sat across from him at the long pine table in the kitchen while me served biscuits and beans and roasted venison that smelled like heaven. The two of them ate in silence for a while that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, and then Sarah said, "Tell me about the ranch." So he did. He told her about the 600 acres his father had built from nothing, about the herd of 340 Hereford cattle that wintered in the lower pastures and summered on the high grass, about the two ranch hands, brothers named Eli and Carl Morrow, who had worked the Double D for 3 years and who were reliable men and good with horses. He told her about the spring that fed the eastern pasture and the trouble he'd had 2 summers ago with drought and how he dug an additional well. Sarah listened. She was a very good listener. She did not perform listening. She simply did it, watching him with that thoughtful, steady attention and asking questions that were precise and useful. She wanted to know about the finances. She wanted to know about the mortgage situation, which there wasn't one, the Dalton ranch being debt-free. She wanted to know about the markets he sold to, about the cattle drives, about the winter feed situation. "You know ranching," he said. "My grandfather had cattle in Missouri," she said. "I grew up understanding the business." A small pause. "My father understood it less well when he decided to farm instead." The word father opened a door neither of them walked through quite yet. "Your father," Isaac said carefully. "I want to discuss his situation, the lien on the homestead." "Yes," she said. "With the debt now resting on a marriage I chose freely, rather than on Fletcher's arrangement, the document's compulsion clause is unenforceable. Your lawyer in Durango confirmed that." "He did." "The marriage voids the compulsion clause, because the clause's authority depended on my having acquired it through the game. But since we married of our own independent will, properly witnessed, before any formal demand was served under that clause, the clause has nothing to act upon. The lien on the homestead is a separate matter, but it is an ordinary debt lien which your father can address in the normal course. And the $800, I will loan it to your father at no interest," Isaac said. "He can repay me gradually in his own time however he is able." Sarah looked at him across the table for a long moment. The lamplight was warm and low, and outside the Colorado night was perfectly clear, the kind of sky you only got in the mountains, enormous with stars. "You are being very generous," she said, and the way she said it was not quite a thank you and not quite a question. "I am being practical," he said. "A man with a troubled family is a man who cannot give his full attention to anything else." She watched him a moment longer. "Is that why you are doing it? Practicality?" He held her gaze. "No," he said. "I am doing it because it is the right thing to do." The ghost of that near smile again. "I thought so," she said. "I just wanted to hear you say it without dressing it up." He felt something shift inside him that was complicated and warm and not entirely comfortable. "You will test me," he said. It came out less as an accusation than as a recognition. "Every woman tests the man she is trusting with her life," Sarah said simply. "It would be foolish not to." He nodded slowly. "That seems fair." "Good," she said and picked up her fork. "More venison." The following 2 weeks were a kind of extended negotiation conducted in the language of ordinary daily life. Sarah rose before dawn without being asked, which was the rancher's schedule, and she learned the Dalton ranch the way she learned everything, by watching carefully and then asking precise questions and then doing. She rode well. Isaac discovered this on the 3rd day when he saddled his own horse for the morning rounds and came out of the barn to find her already mounted on the bay mare he kept for visiting guests, handling the animal with an easiness that spoke of years. "Can you ride the fence line?" he asked. "Show me which one you want checked," she said. They rode together that morning for 3 hours through the gold and copper autumn of the Colorado mountains, and by the time they returned Isaac had told her more about the ranch than he had intended to, not because she had pride but because she asked the right questions in the right way at the right moment, and the answers came naturally. She was not performing interest in the ranch. She was actually interested. She was thinking about it the way a person thinks about something they are trying to understand fully, turning it over in her mind, looking at it from different angles. "The eastern pasture floods in spring," she said when they were standing at the fence line above the creek, looking down at the lower land. "You lose grazing weeks." "I do," he said. "If you diverted the creek flow there," she pointed. "That rocky outcrop would deflect the spring surge. You would still flood, but you would flood the unused ground to the south rather than the pasture." He looked at where she was pointing. He had ridden past that outcrop hundreds of times. "That would need a diversion channel," he said slowly. "Yes, about 40 feet of it, I think. Eli and Carl could dig it before the ground freezes if you started this week." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the landscape with that same focused attention she gave everything, and the morning light was doing something remarkable to the auburn of her hair where it escaped her hat, and he felt that warm, complicated thing again and looked firmly away at the creek. "I will talk to Eli," he said. She was also doing things to the house that he had not expected. Nothing dramatic. She had not arrived and immediately attempted to overturn the established order of the place, which Mee had run with competent efficiency for 6 years. Instead, she worked alongside me, learning where everything was, how the kitchen stove's temperamental second burner behaved, which drawer stuck in damp weather. She mended things. She organized the pantry with a logic that was clearly superior to its previous state. She started a kitchen garden in the sheltered south-facing corner of the yard, planting the garlic and onion sets that would winter over and be ready in spring. Mee, who Isaac had been slightly apprehensive about, Mee was territorial about her kitchen, and not a woman who accepted newcomers easily watched Sarah's approach for 3 days, and then made her verdict known by offering to teach Sarah her recipe for proper New Mexico-style red chili sauce, which Isaac knew was an offer Mee had never made to anyone in his memory. "She has good hands," Mee told Isaac one morning, which in Mee's vocabulary was the highest possible praise. Isaac's ranch hands had a different take. Eli Morrow, 26, dark-haired and quieter of the two brothers, watched Sarah ride fence line with Isaac on the 4th day and said nothing. Carl Morrow, 24, sandy-haired and less good at keeping his opinions to himself, cornered Isaac at the barn. "She is not what I expected," Carl said. "What did you expect?" Carl scratched the back of his neck. "I don't know, something different. You know how people are talking in town." "I know," Isaac said flatly. "What are they saying? That you lost a bet and ended up with a wife who will make your life miserable out of spite?" Isaac looked at him steadily. "And what do you think?" Carl was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that she has already found the problem with the east pasture drainage that you have been meaning to solve for 3 years." "4 years," Isaac said. Carl nodded. Fletcher Webb was not finished. Isaac had known he would not be finished. A man who had spent 2 years constructing an elaborate legal trap to acquire a piece of land does not simply accept that the trap has been sprung from the inside and move on with his life. Fletcher Webb was a man of considerable local influence. He controlled the grain and feed that most of the small farmers in the area depended on, which gave him a kind of economic power that was not always visible until you ran into it. And he was a man whose pride was closely entangled with his plans. The first sign came in the 2nd week, when Isaac went to town for supplies and several merchants were suddenly, and with varying degrees of discomfort, unavailable to extend him the trade credit they had extended for years. Isaac noted this without commenting on it, paid cash for what he needed, and rode home. The second sign came 3 days later, when a man Isaac did not recognize rode out to the Dalton ranch and presented himself as an agent of a Denver land company with an offer to purchase the Townsend homestead. The offer was fair, suspiciously fair, in fact, about 20% above what the land was worth by any honest reckoning, which meant that someone wealthy enough to overpay for a piece of scrubland really wanted it. Isaac received the man on the porch, listened to the offer with a courteous expression, and said he would pass it along to the relevant parties. The man rode away. Sarah was standing in the doorway. Fletcher is not giving up, she said. No, Isaac agreed. He is changing strategy. He thought about it for a moment. He cannot touch us through the original document, so he is trying to pressure the homestead from a different angle. He wants the land as a route to the railroad spur, Sarah said. If he acquires it, he can build a private siding and control the rail access for the whole southern grain region. It is about money and leverage, not just spite. Isaac looked at her. How long have you known about the railroad angle? Since I rode along the south fence of our homestead last spring and noticed that someone had surveyed it. She met his gaze. I believe Fletcher was planning to either buy the land or take it one way or another. The debt and the document were just his preferred method. Why didn't your father? He stopped himself. Sarah's expression was composed and a little sad. My father is a good man, she said. He trusted people too easily and made promises he could not keep. That is not a character flaw exactly. It is just not a useful quality when you are dealing with someone like Fletcher Webb. Isaac nodded slowly. A cardinal rule of the frontier was that you did not speak badly about a man's family. But there was a difference between speaking badly and speaking clearly, and what Sarah was doing was the second thing. She was not bitter about her father. She was simply accurate about him. I need to understand something, Isaac said. If Fletcher acquires your father's homestead by other means, legitimate purchase, now that the debt document is out of play, what happens to your father? He has nowhere to go, Sarah said simply. The silence was answer enough. Your father could come here, Isaac said. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming at a flat angle through the ponderosa pines along the ridge, and it caught the amber in her gray-green eyes in a way that made them look briefly gold. That is a very considerable offer, she said quietly. The ranch house has 6 rooms, Isaac said, with the practiced neutrality of a man who was trying not to let his voice carry more than the words. Me's room is in the back. There is a room that was my grandfather's, empty since I was 15 years old. A man could live there without being anyone's burden. You barely know my father. I know you, he said, and then was mildly surprised at himself for having said it, because he had not precisely intended to, and because it was more true than he had planned to acknowledge aloud. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Isaac, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without a title in front of it, and something about the sound of it in her voice made him hold very still. Thank you. It is the right thing, he said. Yes, she said. I know. She looked at him steadily. But thank you anyway. Howard Townsend moved into the Dalton ranch house 10 days later, bringing with him 3 books, a chest of tools, a mule, and the particular dignity of a man who knows he has failed and is trying not to drown in it. Isaac shook his hand and showed him the room, which Me had aired out and put fresh linen on, and said nothing about gratitude or obligation, which was the right approach, and which Howard Townsend understood and was grateful for without needing to say so. Sarah watched her father unpack his 3 books onto the little shelf above the room's single window, and something in her face in that moment unguarded, for just a second, was such a mixture of relief and old grief and genuine care that Isaac, who was passing the doorway and happened to glance in, felt that complicated warmth in his chest turn into something considerably more specific and considerably harder to ignore. He kept walking. The matter of Fletcher Webb came to a head in November, on a cold gray Tuesday, when Isaac rode into Redemption Creek for the weekly supply run, and found that the mood of the town had shifted in a way he could feel without being able to immediately identify the source. People were talking in doorways and falling quiet when he passed. The woman at the dry goods store, Mrs. Haverson, who had always been perfectly pleasant, met him with a strained expression and asked him if he had seen the notice in the window of the county recorder's office. He had not. He went and looked. The notice was from Fletcher Webb, and it was addressed to the public generally but aimed, unmistakably, at Isaac Dalton specifically. It was a formal challenge to the validity of the marriage, on the grounds that it had been contracted fraudulently. the allegation being that Isaac Dalton and Sarah Townsend had conspired to marry specifically to defeat a legitimate legal instrument, and that such a marriage, being entered into not in good faith, but for the purpose of evading a legal obligation, ought to be declared void by territorial authority. Isaac read it twice, standing in the cold November wind on the boardwalk in front of the county recorder's office, and then folded it carefully, put it in his coat pocket, and went to find Tom Hagen. Tom Hagen ran the barber shop and was, more usefully, a man who had lived in Redemption Creek for 20 years and understood its political landscape the way a river understands its own bed. Isaac found him sweeping the step of his shop and relayed the contents of the notice in brief, efficient terms. Tom was quiet for a moment. "He is pulling in Judge Canfield," he said. "Canfield, the judge who formalized the original document." "The same." Tom leaned on his broom. "Canfield and Webb have been friends for 30 years. If Webb can get Canfield to declare the marriage void on fraud grounds, it puts Webb right back where he was before the wedding, holding a valid legal instrument over a single woman." "Can Canfield actually do that?" Tom scratched his jaw. "He can try. Whether it holds up is another matter." He looked at Isaac carefully. "You are going to need a lawyer." "I already have one," Isaac said. "In Durango." "You may need one in Denver," Tom said. Isaac stood for a moment in the gray November wind, thinking. Then he said, "Tom, that night at the Silver Spur, when Fletcher put the document in the pot." Tom looked at the ground. "Dalton." "I need to know exactly what was said, what was done, whether there are witnesses to the way it was presented." Isaac kept his voice level. "If Fletcher is going to court accusing me of fraudulent intent, I am going to need to be able to demonstrate that the fraud in this situation originated with him, not with me." Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know Pete Calloway was there. Pete is not a man who talks." "No," Tom agreed. "He is not. But he will tell the truth if he is asked to in a court of law, because Pete Calloway has never in his life lied under oath, and he is too old to start." He met Isaac's eyes. "And I was there. I saw what Fletcher did. I saw how he presented it, and I have been thinking for 3 weeks that I should have said something that night." "Tom, I am saying something now," Tom Hagen said firmly. He stood up straight and squared his shoulders. "You tell your lawyer in Durango that he has witnesses." Isaac rode home and told Sarah everything. They sat at the kitchen table again in the lamplight, and he laid out what he knew and what Tom had told him, and Sarah listened without interrupting, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her face very still. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He is going to try to have the marriage declared void." "He is going to try," Isaac said. "And if he succeeds." "He will not succeed," Isaac said, and the flatness in his voice was not anger exactly, but it was something adjacent to anger, a bedrock certainty that this particular thing was not going to happen. "I have Tom Hagen and Pete Calloway as witnesses to how Fletcher handled the original document. I have a lawyer in Durango who is already preparing a response. And I have," he paused for a moment, looking for the right word. "We have the truth." Sarah looked at him. There was something different in her expression tonight. Not the cool assessment of those first days, not the careful composure of the public Sarah Townsend. There was something more open in it, something that was either vulnerability or the beginning of trust, and he could not entirely tell the difference. "You said we," she said. "It is our marriage," he said. "It concerns both of us." "Yes." She looked at her folded hands for a moment. "Yes, it does." She raised her eyes to his. "Isaac, I want you to understand something. When I proposed this arrangement, when I suggested we marry, I was thinking about the law and the trap in the land. I was thinking practically." "I know," he said. "But I am not thinking only practically anymore," she said carefully, as if she were handing him something fragile and watching to see if he would drop it. The lamplight between them was very still. Outside, the Colorado night was deep and cold, and the fire in the stove was the only sound, a quiet, steady crackle. "Sarah," he said. "I just thought you should know," she said, with a composure that was clearly costing her something, and that he found in that moment more moving than any performance of feeling could have been. He reached across the table and covered her folded hands with one of his. He had large hands, ranch rough, and she had fine-boned hands that were rougher than they looked from the work she did, and they fit together in a way that felt less like a gesture and more like a fact. "Good," he said, "because neither am I." She looked at his hand over hers for a moment, and then she turned her hand over beneath his and held on, and the simplicity of it was like something coming loose in his chest that he had not realized was held tight. Howard Townsend appeared in the doorway from the hall at this moment, on his way to the kitchen for a glass of water, saw them at the table, and made a tactical decision to be very interested in the shelf on the opposite side of the room for a moment. Sarah noticed, and a genuine laugh escaped her, brief and bright and entirely unguarded, and Isaac found himself laughing too, and Howard turned around with the elaborate nonchalance of a man pretending he had not seen anything while being transparently delighted. "Good night," Howard said, with great dignity, and retreated. The legal battle with Fletcher Webb lasted 2 months and cost Isaac more in lawyers' fees and time spent riding to Durango than he liked to think about. But it ended in December 1882 in the way that battles end when the truth is actually on your side, and you have people willing to stand up and say so. Tom Hagen gave a sworn affidavit. Pete Calloway gave a sworn affidavit. Isaac's lawyer in Durango, a sharp, methodical man named Arthur Briggs, who had been practicing frontier territorial law for 15 years, and who had a particular contempt for men who misused legal instruments, filed a counter-challenge that exposed the irregular relationship between Fletcher Webb and Judge Canfield, and got the challenge transferred to a different judge in the territorial capital. The territorial court found that the marriage of Isaac Dalton and Sarah Dalton, formerly Townsend, was valid and contracted in good faith, that the original document had been obtained through improper and coercive means, and that Fletcher Webb had engaged in a pattern of behavior that constituted fraudulent inducement of debt and abuse of legal process. Fletcher Webb was fined. He was not jailed, because the territorial court in 1882 did not generally jail men of property for financial fraud, which was an injustice of the era that Isaac's lawyer acknowledged with restrained fury, and that Isaac filed away in his mind as something worth addressing through the political channels he was beginning to think he had ignored for too long. But Fletcher Webb's reputation in Redemption Creek was finished. The details of what he had done, attempting to treat a woman as property, constructing a legal trap designed to steal land through debt coercion, became public record, and in a small frontier community, public record was a more effective punishment than a fine. Howard Townsend's debt was cleared using money Isaac provided, structured as a formal loan against Howard's eventual equity in the homestead. The homestead itself was secured, and Isaac, with the cautious approval of his wife, had a conversation with Howard about the possibility of leasing the homestead land to the Dalton Ranch's grazing operation, which would give Howard a steady income without requiring the kind of heavy labor farming that his health was no longer really suited to. Howard sat quietly through this proposal and then said with considerable effort, "Isaac, I owe you more than I can say." "You do not owe me anything," Isaac said. "You have given me something of considerably greater value." Howard looked at him for a moment, understanding clearly what he meant, and then shook his head slowly and said, "She chose you, you know, from the first day. She will not have said so, but I know her." "I know," Isaac said. "Do you know why?" Isaac thought about it honestly. "Because I came to tell her she did not have to." Howard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, that is exactly why." Christmas of 1882 was the first Christmas Isaac Dalton had celebrated in the ranch house since his father died, and it was nothing like the quiet, slightly melancholy occasions he had managed since then, which had mainly consisted of me making a better-than-usual supper and the Morrow brothers going to their own family in town. Sarah had opinions about Christmas. These opinions were expressed with the same focused energy she brought to drainage problems and pantry organization, and the result was that The ranch house had pine boughs over the fireplace and candles in the windows, and a plum pudding that had been steaming on the back of the stove since a week before because that was apparently how it was done properly. And Howard had carved a small set of wooden figures from memory and arranged them on the mantelpiece. And Eli and Carl Morrow had been invited to Christmas dinner along with their mother and their sister, who had come up from Durango for the season. Isaac stood in the doorway of his own house on Christmas evening and looked at the table full of people, me laughing at something Carl had said, Eli's mother talking to Howard about Missouri, Carl's sister trying to help Sarah with the pudding sauce and getting a good-natured lesson in the process, and felt something that he identified, after a moment, as happiness. Not complicated happiness. Not happiness that needed to be analyzed. Just the simple, round, solid kind that sits in your chest like a coal that will burn for a long time. Sarah came to stand beside him with a cup of coffee and followed his gaze around the table. "It is a good house," she said quietly. "It is better," he said. She looked at him with that steady gray-green attention. "Then what?" "Then it was before you," he said, and watched the warmth move through her face like the light through leaves. They had been sleeping in separate rooms since the wedding. This was something neither of them had explicitly discussed as a permanent arrangement, but neither had they explicitly discussed changing it, because some things in the frontier west of 1882 were navigated through careful silence rather than direct declaration, particularly between two people who had come to their marriage through unusual circumstances and were moving toward each other at a pace set by honesty rather than impulse. It was January when things changed, and it changed because of a snowstorm. The storm came down from the north without much warning, the way Colorado mountain storms sometimes do, and it arrived in the night as a howling white curtain that buried the porch rails by midnight and was showing no sign of stopping. The temperature inside the house dropped significantly despite the stoves, because the wind found every gap in the old stone and timber construction, and by 2 in the morning it was cold enough that me had moved extra blankets to everyone's rooms. Isaac lay awake listening to the storm and thinking about the cattle in the lower pasture, and whether Eli had secured the barn properly, and whether the new roof section he'd had added to the equipment shed in September was going to hold, and around 3 in the morning there was a soft knock at his door. He said, "Come in," thinking it might be Howard with a concern about the storm. Sarah opened the door. She was wearing a wool dressing robe over her nightgown and holding a candle, and her hair was down, loose over her shoulders, dark auburn in the candlelight, and she looked at him with an expression he had not seen before on her, not vulnerable, exactly, but open in a way she was not usually open. "I cannot sleep," she said. "The wind is extraordinary." "It is," he agreed. She looked at him for a moment across the small, cold room. The candle flame bent in a draft and straightened again. "Isaac," she said, "I have been thinking. About the storm, about us," she said. He sat up. "Tell me." She stepped into the room and set the candle on the washstand and sat down on the edge of the chair near the window. Her hands were folded in her lap in the way they folded when she was being careful with something. "We have been treating this as a situation to manage," she said, "which is what it was at the beginning, an arrangement with a practical foundation." She looked at him directly. "But I do not think it is only that anymore, for either of us." "No," he said, "it is not." And I think, she paused, "I think we are both being careful, very careful, in a way that was right at the start but is perhaps now preventing something." "Something," he said very carefully. "Something real," she said. "Something that is trying to happen and is being very patient about waiting for us to stop being so measured about everything." He looked at her in the candlelight with the storm roaring outside and the house cold and close around them, and felt the warmth in his chest that had been building since that first day on the porch of the Townsend homestead become something that was no longer possible to contain or be measured about. "Sarah," he said, "I think I have been in love with you since you set that laundry basket on the porch railing and told me I was a consequence." She looked at him for a long moment. That was the third sentence you ever spoke to me." "Yes," he said. "I know. I cannot explain it except to say that it was true from the moment I saw you and has been getting more true every day since." The wind hit the house in a long, shuddering gust. The candle dipped and flared. Sarah stood up from the chair and crossed the small room and sat beside him on the edge of the bed and looked at his face as though she were reading something she had been trying to understand for a long time. "I think I knew you were a man worth trusting," she said, "the moment you said that a woman was not a gambling stake. But knowing someone is worth trusting and allowing yourself to trust them are two separate things." "I know," he said. "I have been alone in managing things and keeping things together for a long time," she said. "Since my mother died when I was 16, I have been the person who held things, who kept them from falling." She held his gaze steadily. "I do not know how to let someone help me hold things." "You have been learning," he said gently. "Have I?" "The east pasture drainage," he said. "You told me exactly what to do and then let Eli and Carl do it, and you did not stand over them the whole time checking that it was done correctly." Her mouth curved. "I checked on the second day." "Only the second day," he said. "That is significant progress." She laughed that brief, bright, real laugh again, and then she was not laughing and neither was he, and they were very close together in the cold January room, and he took her hands in both of his the way he had across the table that November evening, and she held on. "I love you," she said. "I want to say it clearly because I am trying to stop being so measured." He lifted her hands and kissed them, both of them, and felt her breath catch. "I love you," he said. "That is also clear." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the storm went on roaring outside for another 6 hours, and neither of them gave it very much thought. Spring came to the San Juan foothills of Colorado, the way it always did, reluctantly at first, with cold rain and mud that made the ranch roads treacherous. And then all at once in a rush of new grass and wild columbine and meadowlarks that seemed to have arrived overnight with something urgent to say. The diversion channel on the east pasture held back the spring flood exactly as Sarah had predicted it would, and the grazing land that had been lost to standing water for weeks in previous years was green and dry and productive by the end of April. Isaac stood at the fence line with Sarah one morning in early May and looked at the pasture that was full of Hereford cattle eating good early grass, and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem solved, and then felt an additional and different satisfaction when he looked at the woman standing beside him with her hat pushed back and her face in the Colorado morning sun, which was warm now, genuinely warm, the way it knew how to be at altitude in May. She had her hand on the fence rail and was counting cattle with the efficient, practiced eye of someone who had been doing it all her life. "You are short 3 head on this side," she said. "They will be in the upper draw," he said. "There is a spring there they favor in early May. Eli should check it today. I will tell him." She turned to look at him and found him watching her and did not look away. There was none of the cool assessment of the beginning in her gaze now, or rather the assessment was still there. It was part of who she was, and he had come to understand that it was not distance but a kind of careful intelligence. But underneath it was something warm and direct and entirely sure of itself. "You are happy," she said. It was an observation, not a question. "Profoundly," he said. "Good." She turned back to the pasture. "So am I." He reached out and took her hand on the fence rail, and she interlaced her fingers with his without looking over, and they stood like that for a while in the May morning, which was exactly the right way to stand. In June, Sarah told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, in the practical direct way she told him most things, and watched his face with that careful attention. He was quiet for a moment, absorbing it, and then he put his coffee cup down and came around the table and picked her up out of her chair in a way that was not his usual mode of expressing things, because he was generally a man of considerable physical restraint, and she made a sound of surprise and then wrapped her arms around his neck and held on. "All right," she said into his collar. "I thought you might be pleased." "Pleased is not the word," he said. "What is the word?" He put his face against her hair. "I will think of it," he said. "Give me a while." Me's reaction when she was told was to sit down heavily in a kitchen chair, which was unlike Me, and then to stand up and embrace Sarah with a fierce competence that spoke of everything she did not need to say in words. Howard Townsend, when he heard, sat very still for a long moment on the porch in the June evening, and then said, quietly, "Your mother would have been so glad." And Sarah, who had not cried in Isaac's presence once in 8 months, pressed her lips together very hard and nodded, and Isaac put his hand on her shoulder from behind and felt her lean into it just slightly. The summer of 1883 was the finest summer the Double D Ranch had in years. The cattle were fat on good grass. The new well Isaac had planned was dug and producing. Eli and Carl had settled into the rhythm of the expanded operation, because Sarah had reorganized certain aspects of the work schedule that she had noted were inefficient, with the careful approach of a person who knows they are new and is therefore asking rather than telling. And the reorganization had saved them approximately 2 hours of unnecessary double handling per day, and both brothers were more comfortable and productive for it. Carl Morrow had also, with a sidelong encouragement from Sarah that Isaac only heard about second-hand from Me, finally worked up the nerve to call on a young woman in Redemption Creek named Dorothy Finch, who was the schoolteacher's daughter and who had apparently been waiting for Carl to notice her for 2 years. This development had made Carl noticeably cheerful and somewhat distracted, and Eli bore it with the stoic patience of an older brother who has accepted his lot. Isaac rode into Redemption Creek more frequently than he used to. He had begun attending the county commissioner meetings, which he had previously avoided as time-consuming exercises in local politics that did not concern him directly. The Fletcher Webb business had made him understand, in a concrete way, that the legal and political structures of the frontier were not simply background to his life on the ranch. They were the architecture that either protected ordinary people or could be turned against them, and the difference often depended on whether people of standing and means chose to engage or to ignore. He was not a man given to speeches, but he was a man who showed up and paid attention and asked specific questions, and over the course of 1883, he became someone the county commissioners' meetings noticed and took seriously, which began to have small, practical effects on how certain things were done in the region. Sarah knew about these meetings. She had begun occasionally riding into town with him, and while Isaac was in the commissioner's office, she was elsewhere at the Women's Sewing Circle, which in Redemption Creek functioned less as a sewing circle and more as the information-gathering and opinion-forming center of the community, and where Sarah Dalton, formerly Townsend, had become in the course of about 6 months a person of considerable influence. She was not loud about it. She was simply intelligent and reliable and genuinely interested in people, and those qualities in a frontier town were recognizable and valued. Their son was born in November 1883, 2 days after the first anniversary of the wedding that had started everything. It was a long labor, which Me managed with the competent authority of a woman who had brought several children into the world and regarded the process as serious business but not a crisis. Isaac spent most of the night sitting outside the bedroom door in the hall, listening to the sounds on the other side of it, and feeling something that he later described to Howard Townsend only as the most frightening thing he had ever experienced, which, coming from a man who had tracked outlaws through the San Juan Mountains in January, meant something. The child's first cry came before dawn, in that gray hour when the night is giving itself up but the light has not quite committed, and Isaac's hand on his knee clenched into a fist and then released. Me opened the door and said, "A son, both of them well, come in." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and Sarah looked back at him with the absolutely exhausted, absolutely radiant expression of a woman who has done an enormously difficult thing and knows it, and the baby in the crook of her arm was red-faced and small and making faint sounds of protest at the world. "He is very new," Sarah said. He is perfect, Isaac said, which he meant entirely. He needs a name. They had discussed names, they had a list. Looking at the actual child, Isaac found the list somewhat abstract. What do you think? He asked her. Sarah looked at the baby for a moment. James, she said, for no particular reason except that it seems to suit him. James Dalton, Isaac said. James Howard Dalton, she said, and looked at him steadily. He understood. Yes, he said, James Howard Dalton. Howard Townsend was told in the morning, when the sun was properly up and making the November frost on the windows into something luminous. He stood at the bedroom door and looked at his daughter and his grandson and said nothing for what seemed like a considerable time. He has your mother's nose, he finally said to Sarah. He has a very small, very red nose, Sarah said. I cannot tell what it will be yet. He has her nose, Howard said firmly, and went away down the hall, and me, who was in the kitchen starting breakfast, reported later that she had heard him crying quietly in his room, which was not something Howard Townsend often did, and which she had found the good grace to give him the privacy of pretending not to hear. James Howard Dalton grew through his first winter into a bright-eyed, perpetually opinionated infant who had his mother's focused attention span and his father's alarming self-possession, and who was passed back and forth between me and Howard with a cheerfulness that suggested he considered the whole household his personal domain and everyone in it his devoted subjects, which was not far wrong. Fletcher Webb, by this point, had retreated into a diminished version of his former influence. His grain and feed operation still functioned, but he had lost 2 of his major supplier contracts after the territorial court finding became widely known, and Redemption Creek had the long memory that small communities develop regarding men who have tried to treat their neighbors badly. He was not entirely ruined, because the world in 1882 was not perfectly just, but he was reduced, and the land he had schemed so elaborately to acquire remained out of his reach. The Townsend homestead was running as part of the Dalton grazing operation, and Howard, who had found in the combination of ranch work and grandfatherhood a purpose and energy he had been lacking for years, was managing the lease arrangements with a competence that surprised everyone who had assumed he was simply a man who had given up. He had not given up. He had simply been overwhelmed. Given a proper framework and people he trusted around him, Howard Townsend turned out to be a man of considerable organizational ability, which was perhaps where Sarah had gotten her own. Isaac noted this one evening in the second spring, watching Howard explain the lease accounting to Eli with a clarity and precision that Eli was clearly finding useful, and thought about the way that circumstances could make a man seem less than he was, and how much of what looked like failure was actually just the wrong fit between a person and their situation. He filed this thought away in the part of his mind that was increasingly interested in how the frontier shaped and sometimes broke people, and how it might be made to do the second thing less often. The second child arrived in September 1885. This time Isaac was not outside the door. Sarah had been very direct about that particular aspect of the arrangement, telling him that she found his presence calming rather than complicating, and that he was to stay in the room if he had any fortitude at all, which was a clear challenge and one that Isaac accepted, and the labor was shorter than the first, and the child who arrived at the end of it was a daughter. Well, Sarah said, looking at the child with that same wondering, focused attention she gave to new things. She has your eyes, Isaac said, because she did gray-green even at this very beginning, which me said was unusual for a newborn and which everyone else simply accepted as inevitable. Clara, Sarah said. Clara me Dalton. Me, who had not been consulted in advance on this naming decision, and who received the news when she came in with the fresh water, stopped in the doorway and pressed her lips together very firmly. I do not need you to do that, she said after a moment. I know you do not need it, Sarah said. That is not why I did it. Me set down the water pitcher carefully. Clara me, she said. Then she said nothing further, and she did not need to. By the autumn of 1885, The Double D Ranch was 400 acres larger than when Isaac had inherited it. The expansion had come through two purchases, one of a piece of land to the north that shared a good water source, and one of the Townsend homestead itself, which Howard had finally agreed to sell to the ranch formally, keeping himself a life tenancy arrangement that gave him the security of knowing the land would remain in family hands without requiring him to manage it independently. The ranch herd had grown to 600 cattle, and Isaac had added a small horse breeding operation on the eastern section that was producing animals good enough to have developed a regional reputation. He and Sarah had fallen into the working rhythm of two people who have been partners long enough that the partnership has become seamless, which is different from easy. It was not always easy. They argued, sometimes with genuine heat, about ranch decisions and political matters, and occasionally about things that were really about other things entirely, because they were both people with strong opinions, and neither of them had the temperament to simply defer. But the arguments were honest arguments, and they always resolved into understanding, and neither of them held ground for the sake of pride when the other person's position turned out to be right. Isaac had been elected to the County Board of Commissioners in 1884, which had happened because Tom Hagen had put his name forward at a meeting Isaac had attended, and several other people who had been watching him engage with local issues had seconded the nomination before Isaac had a chance to decline it. He served with the same methodical, specific intelligence he brought to running the ranch, and he focused particularly on the land use regulations and debt instrument laws that had allowed the Fletcher-Webb situation to develop in the first place. He could not fix everything. The territorial law moved slowly, and the interests of wealthy men were well represented in the legal structures of the era, as they always had been, but he could make specific changes in specific places, and he did. Sarah was not on the county board. She was in 1885 not eligible to be, because the territory of Colorado had not yet given women the franchise, which would not come until statehood and the 1893 Constitution, a fact that Sarah found neither surprising nor paralyzing. "The law will change," she said, when they discussed it, which they did. "In the meantime, I know what I think and I tell you and you vote accordingly, which is not ideal but it is functional. You could also go to the meetings yourself," Isaac said. "I do go to the meetings," she said. "I sit in the public gallery. Several of the commissioners are clearly uncomfortable with this." "Good," Isaac said. She smiled at him. "Yes, that was rather my thinking." What Sarah was doing in the meantime was teaching. Not formally. The schoolhouse in Redemption Creek had a teacher, Miss Dorothy Finch, who had become Mrs. Dorothy Morrow in 1884 when Carl had finally proposed. But informally, in the way that people teach when they have something useful to know and see that others need it. She had started holding what she called simply meetings at the ranch monthly for women from the surrounding farms and small holdings, where they discussed practical things: financial literacy, land rights, how to read a debt instrument, what a lien actually was and how it worked, how to identify when a contract was structured against your interests. These meetings grew. By 1885, there were women coming from 20 miles away, and the discussions had expanded to include things like crop rotation, household medicine, legal rights under territorial law, and sometimes just the harder and less technical subject of how to manage when life became more than a person could easily bear alone. Isaac provided the use of the ranch house for these meetings without being asked, simply ensuring that me had enough for the tea and that the main room was cleared and warm, and he made himself scarce on meeting days in the specific manner of a man who understands that the most useful thing he can do sometimes is simply not be in the way. One evening after a meeting day in the autumn of 1885, after the last wagons had rolled away down the ranch road in the late afternoon, Sarah came out to the barn where Isaac was working on a harness and leaned in the doorway and looked at him. "Tom Hagen's wife came today," she said. "Ellen." He looked up. I did not know she had been coming. She has not previously. Sarah leaned against the door frame. She is having difficulties with the property records from Tom's father's estate. Someone has filed a competing claim on the family lot and she cannot understand the documents. I can look at them, Isaac said. I know, Sarah said. I told her that. She paused. Isaac. There are dozens of women in this region with situations like Ellen's. Situations where the legal complexity of property and debt and inheritance is being used against them, or where they simply do not have the knowledge to see what is being done and what they can do about it. I know, he said. We could do more, she said. He set the harness down. What are you thinking? She came properly into the barn and sat on the tack trunk across from him, and he recognized this position. It was her thinking out loud position, the one where she was working through something she had already mostly worked out and was now checking it against his response. A proper office, she said. In town. With access to a lawyer, Arthur Briggs, or someone like him 1 day a week, where people, women particularly, but not only women, could come with their legal problems and receive proper advice and help. He looked at her for a moment. That would require funding. It would. I have thought about that. She held his gaze. The ranch is doing well. We could set aside a portion toward the first year of operating costs, and I believe several of the women who come to the meetings would contribute. Mrs. Haverson, the widow Mackenzie. There are others who have the means and the understanding of why it matters. Isaac was quiet for a moment, looking at his wife in the dusty golden light of the barn, and felt that now familiar warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with temperature. When did you start planning this? He asked. About 6 months ago, she said, with the ghost of that smile. And you are telling me now because I have thought it through sufficiently to know it is viable, she said, and because I need your partnership in it, not your permission. Sarah, he said, and his voice came out with more feeling in it than he intended, you have never needed my permission for anything. No, she said, but I want your partnership. There is a difference. She held his gaze steadily. Do I have it? You have had it, he said, since the day you set that laundry basket on the porch railing. She came across the barn and kissed him, which she did with the same directness and lack of performance that characterized everything she did, and he put his arms around her and held her against him in the warm, dusty light. And outside, the Colorado autumn evening was turning amber, and the meadowlarks were having their last say before dark. The office opened in Redemption Creek in the spring of 1886, in a 2-room building on the south end of Main Street that had previously been used as a land surveyor's office, and that had good light and a proper stove. Sarah ran it, with the assistance of a young woman named Grace Acaffer, the daughter of a freedman farmer who had homesteaded 20 miles north of town after the end of the war, and who had grown up watching her father navigate the complicated and often hostile legal landscape of black landownership in the post-Reconstruction West. Grace was 23, literate, quick-minded, and furious in a contained, productive way about the same things that made Sarah quietly determined. They were, within about 2 weeks, fast friends and effective partners. Arthur Briggs rode up from Durango twice a month to man the legal consultation side of the operation, and the client list grew faster than either Sarah or Grace had anticipated. The needs were many and varied and sometimes straightforward and sometimes not, and what the office provided was not always legal resolution. Sometimes it was simply information, the specific, practical knowledge of what rights a person had and how those rights could be exercised, which was often more powerful than any formal legal action. Isaac watched his wife build this thing with the same focused energy she had brought to every other problem she had decided to solve, and the pride he felt in her was so large and so steady that it had become simply part of the atmosphere of his life, like altitude or the sound of the creek. James, who was nearly 3, was developing opinions about cattle that were already impressive in their specificity, and who could not be placed near a horse without immediately attempting to be on it. Clara, a quieter and more watchful child who had her mother's gray-green eyes and her grandfather's gift for careful observation, was being devoted to by Howard Townsend, who had found in his granddaughter an audience of ideal quality, attentive, appreciative, and endlessly curious. Howard's health was not what it had been. He was 54, which in 1886 was not young, and the years of hard work and harder worry had left marks. He moved more slowly than he had when he'd arrived at the ranch house 4 years ago. But he was content, genuinely, quietly content, in a way that he had not been for a long time. He told Isaac one evening on the porch, watching the sun go down behind the San Juans in its extravagant October way, that he had not expected the last years of his life to feel like this. Like what? Isaac asked. Like they matter, Howard said simply. Like the things I do in them matter to people I love. He was quiet for a moment. That is not something a man should take for granted. No, Isaac agreed. You have been good to my daughter, Howard said. Better than she would ever say because she does not think in those terms, but I see it. She has been, Isaac paused, looking for the word that was adequate. She has been everything, he said. Howard looked at him with the approval of a man who has watched closely and made a considered judgment. Yes, he said, she has a way of being that. Howard Townsend died in the winter of 1887, quietly in his room in the ranch house in the early morning. Me found him. He had gone in his sleep, which was the best way, and his face was peaceful. And on the shelf above the window his 3 books stood in a row, and the small wooden figures he had carved for the first Christmas were still on his dresser because he had liked having them there. Sarah grieved her father with the same directness she brought to everything else in her life, fully, without deflection, without the performed composure that some people used as armor against the actual weight of loss. She cried, and she talked about him, and she went through his things carefully and kept the things that held meaning and gave the tools to men who could use them, and she put his 3 books on the shelf in her and Isaac's room. James and Clara were old enough to understand that their grandfather was gone, and that this was something irreversible and sad. James, who was 3.5, processed this information by becoming very quiet for 3 days, and then announcing at supper that grandfather was in the horses, which he appeared to mean as a comfort and which was, in its way, impossible to argue with. Clara, who was not yet 2 but was preternaturally perceptive, spent a great deal of those days very close to her mother, pressing her small, solid warmth against Sarah's legs, or sitting in her lap with the instinctive therapeutic intelligence of a child who understands comfort even before she understands loss. Isaac held the space around Sarah's grief with the care of a man who had learned, over 5 years, when to speak and when to simply be present, and which of these was needed was something he had become quite good at reading. He held her at night when she could not sleep and listened when she wanted to talk and said nothing when silence was the right thing, and he let himself miss Howard too, because he had genuinely liked the man, had valued his quiet presence and his slow-developing sense of humor and the particular dignity of a person who had been reduced and had found his way back. The spring after Howard died was the spring that the 3rd child arrived, another son, born in April with the first wildflowers, whom they named Howard Isaac Dalton, and who was from his first hours a person of powerful lungs and emphatic opinions that seemed to be directed at the world in general. He is already arguing, Sarah said, looking at the new baby with the exhausted amusement of a woman who has done this before and knows the signs. He has good models, Isaac said. She looked at him. Did you just say that I argue? I said we have good models, both of us. She considered this and appeared to find it accurate enough not to contest. Young Howard, who immediately became Howie in the family vocabulary, had his father's dark hair and his mother's absolute certainty about what he wanted at any given moment, and he grew through his first year with a gusto that kept me in a state of productive alarm and made James, now 4, feel very important in his role as older brother. By 1889, the year Colorado was preparing for statehood under the newly proposed Constitution, which would come in 1876. Isaac corrected himself when he thought about it. Colorado had achieved statehood in 1876, which meant they were now 13 years a state, and the political landscape was mature enough to be having serious discussions about the women's suffrage amendment that would come to the state ballot in 1893. Isaac had been on the county board for 5 years and was being talked about for a state assembly seat, which he had not sought and was not certain he wanted, but which Sarah was characteristically direct about. "You should do it," she said. "It would mean time in Denver," he said. "Considerable time," she agreed. "I know. The ranch, Eli is ready to manage the ranch with my oversight," she said. "We have discussed this." Isaac looked at her. "You have discussed it with Eli." "I have discussed the question in general terms with Eli without telling him specifically why I was asking," she said. "He is ready. He has been ready for 2 years. You have been managing him more closely than you need to because you like control." Isaac was briefly quiet. "That is a specific observation. I have known you for 7 years," Sarah said. "I am allowed specific observations." She looked at him steadily. "Isaac, the things you have been working on at the county level, the debt instrument reforms, the land rights issues, the legal protections for homesteaders, those things need to be worked on at the state level, and they need people who understand them from the inside, from actual experience and not just from theory." "You could make the same argument for yourself," he said. "I could," she said. "And in time I will." There was nothing wistful about the way she said it. It was simply a statement of intention. "But right now the law says I cannot hold the seat and you can, and these things need doing. So do them." He looked at her for a long moment, the woman who had arrived at his doorway as a consequence and had become the architecture of everything he valued. "When did you decide this?" he asked. "About a year ago," she said. "You have been waiting for me to come to it on my own." "I have been letting you develop the idea at your own pace," she said with that near smile. "I find it is more effective." "Because if you had told me a year ago, you would have thought of 17 reasons why it was impractical and argued them all," she said. "But you have had a year to get used to the shape of it, and now you only have 2 or 3 reasons, and those are manageable." He stared at her. "That is an alarming level of strategic patience." "Thank you," she said. Isaac Dalton won the state assembly seat in the 1890 election by a margin that surprised the incumbent and nobody who knew him well, and he went to Denver in January 1891 for the legislative session with a list of specific things he intended to address, which Sarah had helped him compile, and which was typed out on the new Remington typewriter she had acquired for the office in town. The family came to Denver for part of the session, which was a logistical undertaking that Mee managed with her usual comprehensive authority. James, who was 7 and had his father's focused intelligence, found Denver astonishing and somewhat overwhelming and took notes. Clara, who was 5, was unimpressed by the size of the city and very impressed by the Opera House, which she decided on the spot was her intended destination. Howie, who was 3, was interested primarily in the horses. Sarah spent the Denver months doing 2 things simultaneously: supporting Isaac's work in the assembly, where she attended sessions in the public gallery, and reviewed draft legislation in the evenings at the kitchen table of their rented house on Sherman Avenue, and building connections with the women's organizations that were already, in 1891, actively working toward the suffrage amendment that would come to a state ballot in 1893. She came home from a meeting at the Colorado Woman Suffrage Association one February evening, with her cheeks bright from the cold and her eyes alive, in a way he recognized as the look of a person who has found people who are doing the thing she has also been doing, and who has discovered that the work is larger and more coordinated than she had realized. "They have been organizing for years," she said, taking off her coat in the hallway. "Susan B. Anthony came through Colorado in 1877. There is infrastructure here, real infrastructure, and the 1893 ballot is not a guess, it is a plan. And you are going to be part of it," Isaac said. "I have always been part of it," she said. I am simply finding the wider edges of it now. She was. The next 2 years were among the most energetic of a life that had not, in Isaac's observation, ever lacked for energy. She went back to Redemption Creek when the legislative session ended and continued running the office with Grace, who had by now become a figure of considerable community standing in her own right. And she traveled to Denver, to Colorado Springs, to Pueblo, for the suffrage campaign, which was building toward the November 1893 election. Isaac, back in Redemption Creek between sessions, managed the ranch with Eli, who was proving exactly as capable as Sarah had predicted, and he watched his children grow, James at 9, a serious, methodical boy who had already decided he wanted to study law. Clara at 7, a creative, opinionated girl who negotiated her way through the world with a combination of charm and intelligence that reminded him strongly of her mother. Howie at 5, an energetic, loud, deeply affectionate child who was universally loved by every animal on the ranch and most of the humans. He also, in the sessions of 1891 and 1892, managed to push through 2 pieces of legislation. He was particularly invested in a reform of the debt instrument laws that made the kind of arrangement Fletcher Webb had constructed significantly harder to execute legally, and a strengthened Homesteader Protection Act that gave small landowners better legal recourse against predatory liens. Neither piece of legislation was perfect. Both had been compromised through the assembly process in ways that frustrated him. But they were there, on the books, and they would help people, and that was what mattered. The Colorado Women's Suffrage Amendment passed in November 1893, making Colorado the second state in the nation after Wyoming to grant women the right to vote. The margin was not enormous, but it was decisive, and Isaac was at home in Redemption Creek when the results came in on the telegraph wire, and he went to find Sarah in the back room of the office, where she and Grace Acaffer were going over client files, and he stood in the doorway and said simply, "It passed." Sarah looked up from the files. Her expression held a long moment of stillness, and then something moved across her face that was not triumph. Exactly. It was quieter and more complete than triumph. And she stood up and Grace stood up, and they embraced each other in the way that people embrace when they have worked toward something together for a long time, and it has come to be. Isaac watched them from the doorway and felt a thing in his chest that had no precise name, so large and so warm that he simply let it be nameless. Later, when Grace had gone home and they were walking back to where the horses were hitched in the autumn evening, Isaac and Sarah walked side by side through the main street of Redemption Creek, which was modest and familiar, and the air smelled of pine smoke and fall, and the mountains were dark against the sky. "Your father would have been glad," he said. "Yes," she said. She took his arm as they walked. "He would have said it was inevitable." Was it? She thought about it. "Nothing is inevitable until people make it so," she said. "But this, yes. I think this was the kind of thing that was always going to happen, once enough people decided to make it happen." She looked up at the October stars, which were beginning to show through the dusk. "The decision is the thing." "It always was," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Is that a comment on us?" "Everything is a comment on us," he said. "After 11 years, everything is a comment on everything." She laughed, and the sound of it in the quiet evening street was bright and real and entirely her own, and he put his hand over hers on his arm and held it there, walking home through the Colorado dark. "They had 12 more years that I could tell you of, and they were full of things worth telling. The year the creek flooded and the Morrow brothers worked 3 days without sleeping to move the herd to high ground. The summer James went east to read law at a Denver firm and came back taller and more sure of himself, and still, underneath it, the serious, focused boy who had taken notes about the city at 7. Clara's discovery of painting, which she pursued with the focused intensity of the Dalton side of the family, producing canvases that were strong and strange and entirely her own. Howie's gift with horses, which turned into a proper breeding business by the time he was 16, with a reputation that reached as far as Santa Fe. Isaac served 2 more assembly terms and then stepped back, because there were things he could do better from the ranch than from Denver, and because the work of raising 3 children and running a 600-acre operation, and continuing to build the legal aid office that had become a fixture of southwestern Colorado, was enough for 2 people's lifetimes, let alone one. Me retired at 65 to a small house in Redemption Creek that the Daltons bought for her outright, and where she was immediately besieged by the neighborhood children, who had learned that she was the person to visit if you had a cut that needed tending, or a problem that needed the kind of advice that did not mind being plain. She visited the ranch every week for Sunday dinner without fail until the year she died, which was 1904, and she went at 81 with the same competent authority that had characterized everything she did, which was the right way for her to go. Grace Ackaffer became, in 1896, the first black woman to argue a property rights case before the Colorado State Court, which was a distinction she received with appropriate gravity, and then went back to work with. She married a man named Thomas Ackaffer, who had come west from Tennessee and was running a dry goods operation in a neighboring town, and she and Sarah were friends of the deepest and most durable kind for the rest of their lives. Fletcher Webb sold his grain and feed operation in 1892 to a larger company out of Denver and moved away from Redemption Creek without announcement, and nobody was particularly sorry to see him go. The legal reforms Isaac had pushed through the assembly made the kind of arrangements Fletcher had specialized in significantly harder to construct, which was not justice exactly, but was a form of the world improving itself. And Isaac and Sarah, they grew into each other the way that people grow into things they have chosen fully and honored faithfully, with the kind of depth that has nothing to show for itself except everything. He was 53 when Clara married a quiet, capable man named Robert Whitfield, who was a geologist working the San Juan mining surveys, and who had the sense to understand exactly what kind of woman he was dealing with, and to find it the best thing about her. He was 54 when James came home from Denver with his license to practice law, and a young woman from Denver named Margaret, who had a direct gaze and a laugh that filled the room, and who fit herself into the Dalton family with the ease of a person who has recognized something she wants to be part of. He was 55 when he sat on the porch of the Stone Ranch house in the October evening and watched Sarah across the yard, where she was showing Howie's youngest mare something or other about the way the horse was holding her left front leg, and the autumn light was exactly as it had been on that first morning when he had ridden to the Townsend homestead 23 years ago, gold and flat and clear as water. She had silver in her hair now, threaded through the auburn, and her hands were more marked by work than they had been, and the lines at the corners of her eyes were the lines of a person who had lived fully in weather and feeling both, and he looked at her and thought the same thing he had thought on a cold January night when she stood in his doorway with a candle and said, "She is not afraid of anything." And he thought, "I have never in my life been more glad of a bet I lost." She turned and saw him watching from the porch. The horse stretched her head toward her shoulder, and Sarah stroked the animal's neck absently without looking away from him. "What are you thinking?" She called across the yard. "That I am the luckiest man in the territory of Colorado," he called back. "It has been a state since 1876, she said. "You are always saying that. It is not a territory." "It was when I was born," he said. "I am exercising historical prerogative." She was smiling, the full, unguarded version, not the near smile, the real one that he had spent the first months of their marriage waiting to see, and had spent the rest of it grateful to see as often as he did. She walked across the yard toward the porch with the mare following her like a large, affectionate dog, and she came up the steps and looked at him in the October evening. "You are the luckiest man in Colorado," she said. "Yes," he said. "Lucky because of the bet," she said, with a particular careful gravity that told him she was actually saying something. "No," he said. Lucky because of what came after. She sat down in the other chair on the porch, in the way of two people who have sat in their particular chairs on their particular porch for so long that the chairs know them. The mountains were doing their extravagant sunset thing as they always did, layers of amber and pink above the dark line of the pines. The mare ambled off to investigate the water trough by the barn. "Do you know what I have been thinking about?" Sarah said. "The office," he said. She looked at him. "How did you know?" "Because you have been carrying something for 3 weeks, and it is not the children, they are all well, and it is not the ranch. We are having a very good year, and the last time you looked this way for this long you were thinking about expanding the office, which you then told me about and then did." He looked at her. "What is it this time?" She leaned back in the chair and looked at the mountains. "Grace and I have been talking about establishing something more formal," she said. "A proper organization, with a charter and funding and a reach beyond just southwestern Colorado. There are women's legal aid associations in other states. There is no coordinating body in Colorado. We think there should be." He was quiet for a moment. "You would need to travel." "Yes. More than you do now." "Yes." He looked at her profile against the evening sky. 23 years of that profile, and it still had the same effect on him as it had in the lamplight of that first supper in the pine kitchen, which he had always found slightly unreasonable and entirely welcome. "When do you want to start?" he asked. She turned and looked at him. "We want to file the charter papers in the spring." "Then file them in the spring," he said. She held his gaze for a moment with that gray-green steadiness that still, after all these years still, saw him more clearly than he was comfortable with and more kindly than he deserved. "You are a good man," she said. "I said I wanted to make sure you never regretted either the bet or the marriage." "Sarah, I want to ask you honestly," she said. "After all of it, do you?" He looked at her for a long moment in the Colorado evening. This woman who had arrived as a consequence and had become the whole of what he wanted his life to be. This woman who had solved the East Pasture drainage and saved her father's land and built an office where people found the help they needed and helped push a constitutional amendment through a state ballot and raised 3 children who were already, in their various ways, becoming remarkable. This woman who held his hand in the cold and argued with him honestly and laughed with her whole self and asked him direct questions because she was finished being measured and wanted to live in the full real thing. "No," he said. "I have never regretted a single minute of either." She reached over and took his hand on the arm of the chair and laced her fingers through his, and they sat together watching the last of the light leave the San Juan Mountains and the stars begin to appear in the vast Colorado sky, and the evening settled around them like something that had always known exactly where it belonged. The ranch house was behind them, warm-windowed and solid. Inside, the sounds of supper being assembled drifted from the kitchen, and somewhere in the upper part of the house, Howie was having a conversation with himself about something at the volume he brought to everything. And on the shelf in the bedroom upstairs, 3 books stood in a row below the window where a man had put them. And on the mantelpiece in the front room, the small wooden figures still stood where they had always stood. And on the porch of the Double D Ranch, Isaac Dalton held his wife's hand in the evening and thought, "The best thing that ever happened to me came out of the worst thing I ever did, and that is the most remarkable gift the world has ever given any man." He did not say this out loud, because there are things that are best held in the chest where they are warm and real and do not require translation. But Sarah, who could read him after 23 years the way she read the pasture and the weather and the law, turned and looked at him with those gray-green eyes and smiled the full smile and squeezed his hand once. She knew. She had always known. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.